Before we can talk about decolonization, we have to talk about colonization. And it's important for us all to remember that although colonization is often spoken and taught about as an introduction of one culture to another, it is very deliberate and intentionally a process that seeks not to fill a void or to share a space, but to replace something that is pre-existing, and to do so by means of complete destruction or eradication of what is pre-existing in the space that colonial culture seeks to inhabit. The colonial philosophy and doctrine is very explicit in the belief that colonial ways of life are fundamentally mutually exclusive with other ways of life. And though there are colonial ideologies that do allow for various forms of coexistence or tolerance, for example, the subordination of pre-existing practices rather than complete eradication, for the purposes of this presentation, we're referring to the colonial ideology under which the Americas were conquered and colonized, and continue to be occupied. And that includes the notion that the practice, or even tolerance, of one way of life was in and of itself a denial of colonial ways of life. Colonialism wasn't just an ideology or the culture. This was actually policy. This was a law. This is the doctrine of discovery. And I pulled out a few little excerpts that I thought were especially potent. So the doctrine of discovery was written by Pope Alexander VI, 1493, which was a time when Europe was united under the Catholic Church, not just in a religious sense, but legally and politically. In today's terms, comparable to the United Nations or the European Union. Nowadays, we have a separation of church and state, but this is from a time when the church was the state, a regulating body responsible for managing the state of affairs. And the doctrine of discovery is a protocol of international law, what we would now call international law, that could be compared to the Geneva Convention. It was incredibly important in delegating what it meant to discover, claim ownership, and even after the establishment of government and democracy, the legal basis, essentially finders keepers, that's established in this document continued to be carried over into future forms of international law. The ownership and rights of any indigenous people, any people inhabiting any land or area, were invalid. And actually, this is very much in play today. The reason why our national and international law still permits the forced occupation of indigenous land. So colonization is the law of the land that resulted in Europe's quest to discover faraway lands and claim them for their own country. Colonialism is the culture and the society that this process yielded. So I want us to begin shifting our thinking at this point to recognize colonialism as a culture, the culture of our society, as a function of the colonization that led to the building and founding of our current society here in America. It's why we use metal and paper currency, why we punish people by putting them in dungeons or prisons, as we call them now, why our nation's wealth is held in banks, why we dress the way we do, why we speak English, and why we read and write in the Roman alphabet. So most of us will have heard the term manifest destiny, given to describe the spirit of essentially American colonization, us or them idea that if the U.S. didn't take these lands, then the European colonial powers would. And so it was this race for America. by the American people and became a part of American identity. And so began the exploitation and destruction of everything, but it was for America, for God, for duty, for higher power, for the greater good. A question to maybe ask yourself is in what ways we might still be manifesting this destiny, and to what end? Decolonization. What does that mean? The shared definition that I've been able to find is the undoing of colonization. We are using decolonization to let go of some colonial ways of thinking and reasoning in order to access that which colonialism excludes, which is anything and everything that exists outside of colonialism. And functional decolonization is how we do it.